Hi everyone, my name is Neil Benson. Thanks for joining me in this DynamicsCon session, Tell Me a Story. I'd love to get to know you a little better, so please enter your name and where you're from in the chat session, and a number between 1 and 10 that represents how advanced or expert you are at managing your business applications requirements in an agile product backlog. A 1 if you don't know what a product backlog is, and a 10 if you think that you should be presenting this session. I'm on a mission to help everyone build amazing Microsoft business applications using the Scrum framework. And what I'm going to share with you today are some proven practices that my teams have used to manage their requirements. When we're using an agile approach, we've realized the futility of trying to specify all the requirements up front at the start of a project. Writing detailed requirements when we know least about what the users need, and when the users know nothing about the application, just leads to heartbreak. When we use an agile approach like Scrum, we capture our high-level requirements in a product backlog. The product backlog is an ordered list of everything we need to do to meet our goals for the application. The proven practices I'm going to share are all agile software development practices borrowed from other places that my teams have added to the scaffolding provided by the Scrum framework. Here's what we're going to cover. User story maps, or story maps for short, are an artifact devised by Jeff Patton, covered in his book, User Story Mapping. Discover the whole story and build the right product. Scrum doesn't have a lot to say about project planning or release planning. I've found that user story mapping is a great way for teams to quickly visualize the scope, timeline, resources, and costs of their business applications project. Part of story mapping and managing your product backlog in general is knowing who your persona are and what they need and want in a way that your development team can empathize with them and build an application they will love. According to the Scrum Guide, the items in the product backlog should be estimated, but it doesn't tell you how. I'll share with you how my teams play planning poker to estimate their work quickly and sufficiently accurately. I encourage my teams to categorize their product backlog items into 5 types: epics and stories, chores, spikes, and defects. You'll learn how my teams use each of these item types and manage them in our backlogs. I'll show you my recommended practice for handling non-functional requirements in your product backlog, just in case someone tells you your application needs to be easy to use, or everything has got to load in under a second, or work in any browser, and meet security requirements you've never heard of. Non-functional requirements are non-fun, but essential. Lastly, I'll give you a couple of ideas for tools to manage your product backlog. We've got lots to cover. Let's go. Story maps. A story map provides a 2-dimensional product backlog that enables your team to plan its project and the production releases within it quickly and easily. The product backlog is a big list of everything we need our application to do. Here's a small product backlog with some high-level requirements for some features needed in a purchase order system. The trouble is that the items are ordered based on business value, so the backlog can be reordered at any time as business priorities shift and new items get added. Imagine we start adding all the other finance features needed in the application to our product backlog. It becomes impossible for our product owner to tell whether we had captured all the purchase order requirements or when she can expect the purchase order feature to be done. We can convert our 1-dimensional product backlog into a 2-dimensional user story map. From left to right, we will describe all the activities in our business process in a time sequence. From top to bottom, we will describe the steps under each activity in a descending priority sequence. Here are the 3 major activities in our purchasing process: raise and approve requisitions, issue purchase order to a vendor, and match a vendor invoice to our purchase order. In this example, we have 6 steps under our activities. This is a simple example, so there are just 2 steps under each activity, but it doesn't usually work out as neatly as that. When we read the steps from left to right, we call this the narrative flow in user story mapping. Business processes can have alternative flows with optional steps, and we can add these to our user story map underneath the primary steps. We arrange them by priority, often representing how frequently the alternative steps occur or how important we feel it is to support a new capability. For example, we might know that requisitions are rejected 20% of the time, so we need a step called Reject a Requisition. But we also want to introduce a new feature into our system to automatically approve most requisitions, perhaps based on some business rules or AI. Next, we slice our story map horizontally. If we're doing long-term project planning, each slice often represents a release into production. If we are doing medium-term release planning, each slice might represent one sprint. How do we know how many steps we can include in a slice? We need to estimate the work. I'll cover estimating work later in the session, but for now, let's suppose that the development team has estimated the relative sizes of each of the steps to be between 13 points and 100 points. Each point represents the relative amount of complex work. Next, we total the amount of work in each slice. In this example, the first slice adds up to 159 points. The second slice is 140 points, and the last slice is 140 points as well. Now we need to make two assumptions. First, the development team will need to guesstimate its initial velocity. Velocity is a measure of how much work the team can get done in a time-boxed period, called a sprint. Often a sprint is 2 weeks, but it can be up to 1 month. We're estimating work in story points, so velocity is estimated as story points per sprint. Team Superhero has estimated they can get 40 points done in each 2-week sprint. Estimating your initial velocity is tricky to do if your development team has never worked together before, or if you're a new Microsoft partner working with a client for the first time. My recommendation is to estimate your velocity based on similar projects. Then deliver 3 sprints and use your average velocity to recalculate the velocity used in your user story map. In our example, the first slice will take 4 sprints to get done, and the next 2 slices will take about 3.5 sprints to get done. Next, we need to estimate the run rate. The run rate is the fully loaded cost of all the development team members working on the project for one sprint. If you're a Microsoft customer working with a partner, it includes the consulting fees of the Microsoft partner and should also include your internal resource costs and any other third parties you expect to assist with the project. If we estimate the run rate to be $20,000 per sprint, now we can calculate the cost of each slice. The estimated cost of slice 1 is $160,000. Slices 2 and 3 will each cost about $150,000. Now, our product owner can set expectations with our stakeholders about the scope, timeline, required resources, and the costs of our project. We don't need to spend months running the analysis and design phases of a traditional project. Our product backlog is high level, but probably just as accurate and certain as a Gantt chart, and a lot more receptive to change. Here's an example from one of my recent projects. This story map is about 10 meters wide, wrapping around 2 walls in this conference room, and it's over 2 meters tall. It's a great place to meet our project stakeholders and discuss the scope, the priority, and the sequence. It's also led to a new phrase, below the skirting board, which means it's not going to get done. Persona. A persona represents a group of people that have common goals, interests, characteristics, requirements, or behaviors. Persona help teams focus on how different features would be used by different people and helps developers understand the different point of view of those people that we're building the system for. Considering the needs of all your personas gives us the confidence that we've considered everyone's requirements and therefore haven't missed anything out. Some personas will be users of your Microsoft business application. They might even become security roles in our system. As well as users, the other categories of personas you often see are internal stakeholders, like your IT security team or trading team. External stakeholders, such as an industry regulator or government agency, and other systems that integrate with your Microsoft business application. Here's an example persona for a park ranger in a Dynamics 365 field service project. I recommend describing the name and main goal of each persona. To determine the personas for your project, I recommend your Scrum team brainstorms all the possible personas that could possibly want or need something from your system. Don't forget to include those personas such as IT security that might provide non-functional requirements. Your product owner should invite anyone with domain expertise into this persona brainstorming workshop. Next, refine those persona into similar groups and remove any duplicates. Our field service team settled on a set of 9 personas in 4 groups and summarized the primary role for each persona. Personas help your development team better understand your users and stakeholder groups. Personas help us empathize with our users' needs and goals and build better features that will cause our users to fall in love with our applications. Estimating work. Absolute estimation is when we need to estimate the actual size of something. If I asked you to estimate the market capitalization of a company in dollars or estimate the amount of work it would take to get a requirement done in days, those are examples of absolute estimation. They have a defined unit of measure, dollars or days. Here's a list of 10 countries arranged alphabetically. Can you quickly estimate the size of each country in square kilometers? No. Let's check our answers. How many of these did you get right? I don't know about you, but I find absolute estimation really difficult. The silhouettes helped, but when I first tried this exercise, my estimates were all over the place. Let's try another approach. Relative estimation is when we estimate the size of 2 or more things relative to each other. For example, estimating the market capitalization of Microsoft compared to Salesforce. Luckily, in a business applications project, we always seem to have at least 2 requirements, so relative estimation becomes an option. Studies have shown that humans are better at relative estimation than we are at absolute estimation. Here's an example. Here's our list of countries again. Once again, arranging them in order is a helpful part of the technique. Now let's take Uruguay and call it a 1. It's a 1 Lego stud country, which means if Uruguay was a Lego brick, it would measure 1 stud by 1 stud. It's an 8mm by 8mm brick. Germany seems to be about twice the size of Uruguay, so let's call Germany a 2. If Germany was a Lego brick, it would measure 1 stud by 2 studs. France is about the size of Uruguay and Germany put together, so we call it a 3. Pakistan seems to be about the same size as France and Germany combined, so we'll call Pakistan a 5. Mongolia seems to be about the same size as France plus Pakistan, so let's call it an 8. Denmark, when Greenland is included, is about the size of Pakistan and Mongolia, so we'll call it a 13. You might have noticed a pattern in these numbers. It's called a Fibonacci sequence. Each number in the sequence is the sum of the previous 2 numbers. The Fibonacci sequence is often found in natural spirals as well. The numbers 21, 34, 55 and 89 can be a little bit hard for most of us to work with and add up, so lots of teams use a modified Fibonacci sequence like this one. Here's the list of countries completed using our modified Fibonacci sequence of Lego bricks. Next, I'll show you how my teams apply relative estimation using a modified Fibonacci sequence to the items in our product backlog. First, take one of your small requirements that appears fairly well understood. This is our baseline requirement. Let's call it a 2-point item. Any items about half the size of our baseline, we'll give those an estimate of 1 point. We use 3, 5 and 8-point estimates for any items that seem about 1.5, 2.5 or 4 times bigger than our baseline. Like many Scrum teams, in my Microsoft Business Applications projects, we estimate our requirements in story points. I think they should be called Lego studs, but that hasn't caught on yet. We have a rule that requirements need to be between 1 point and 8 story points to meet our definition of ready. Bigger than 8 points, and they just represent too much complexity and risk for us to work on them in a sprint. We like to split bigger items up into smaller items just before we add them to our sprint backlog. We use the upper end of the story point range for estimating epics. An epic is simply a user story that's too big for one person to get done in a single sprint. But we still find it useful to estimate the relative sizes of the epics in our backlog for longer-term release planning. You saw epics with story points between 13 and 100 earlier when we learned about user story mapping. Planning poker is a gamified technique for reaching a team consensus for your estimates. It's better than having just an architect or a senior developer within the team review all the requirements and estimate them, because you get a diverse range of opinions from a team with a range of specialist skills such as analysis, configuration, development, testing, and deployment. This produces more accurate estimates and helps everyone buy into those estimates. Here's how we play planning poker. First, we discuss the item to gain a common understanding, to get our questions answered, and uncover our assumptions about it. Then we choose the relative size that we think represents this item using the modified Fibonacci sequence. Then we reveal our individual estimates to the rest of the team. We discuss divergent estimates, especially the highest and the lowest. We either agree a consensus, and if we can't, we play again. I encourage my teams to play planning poker towards the end of their storytime workshops that are held once or twice each sprint. We can also use planning poker during user story mapping workshops to estimate epics in our medium or long-term planning. User stories. Kent Beck envisaged stories, now better known as user stories, as a way of describing a software feature from the point of view of our users. User stories remind us to have a conversation with the users about the feature they want. Once we've had the conversation, we can update the user story with a few more details, acceptance criteria, maybe a prototype wireframe, or some other notes about what we've discussed. But a user story isn't a specification. Developers should be having frequent conversations with users to reach a shared understanding of what's needed. In Scrum projects, we're working side by side with the product owner and the users every day. So we should be discussing, refining, clarifying requirements all the time. Even when the user story is done, it's possible that another user story could enhance or modify the product backlog item we've just developed. Bill Wake provides a handy mnemonic for checking the quality of a user story. Independent. Stories are easiest to work with if they're not dependent upon other backlog items. Independent stories can be prioritized and developed at any time. But unfortunately, user stories aren't always independent, which is why we see estimates such as 3 for the first story and 1 for each of the next 3 related stories. Negotiable. Negotiable stories capture the essence of the requirement and give the development team some design flexibility. If a story is an explicitly designed requirement, it'll sound non-negotiable and give the development team no room for creativity. Valuable. Each user story needs to have some customer value on its own. It's important to remember value when splitting big stories into little ones. Don't split stories so that all the value is in the last story. Each story should add some value on its own. Estimatable. There should be enough detail in the story title and description that mean the team can estimate it. Requirements for capability are not an estimate. For example, as a user, I can configure a workflow to automate a step in a business process. Avoid capability requirements like these and instead specify how the user will use a feature of the system. Small. I recommend a baseline story that's about 2 points of effort to get done. I recommend splitting big stories into smaller stories just before starting development. Smaller stories are easier to estimate and easier to get done successfully. Testable. Testability has always been a characteristic of good requirements. As a developer, how will I know when this story is done? The trick here is to avoid untestable adjectives such as easy to use or fast or quickly or intuitive. This is a typical card for a user story. Each user story should have at least these 5 parts. A unique identifier. Every requirements management system should give you a unique identifier. Otherwise, you'll have to track the IDs manually if you're using something like Excel. Title. Try short, descriptive titles. Stick to a consistent structure such as action, object, update and opportunity, resolve a case, run a report, notify the customer, and so on. Who is it for? I recommend using persona names such as Park Ranger or Property Manager. What do they want? What feature does the persona need or want? Describe what it is they need to do from their perspective. Why is it valuable? What benefit does the persona get from the feature? If we're using a backlog management system like Azure DevOps, our 5x3 index card is a story record in that electronic backlog. There are lots of advantages to tools like Azure DevOps or Jira, but for new Scrum teams, I recommend being co-located and working with real cards stuck on a wall, as well as having a system. Acceptance criteria capture the detail of the story and remind us of the conversations that the developers have had with the users. They signal when the story will be finished. When all the tests are met, the product owner should be able to accept the story as done. Acceptance criteria also helps the testers in our team write fully fledged acceptance tests. We refine all the current sprint's user stories before we start the sprint. A well-refined user story will include all the acceptance criteria that the product owner needs. It's okay to add a couple of small acceptance criteria as we develop the story early in the sprint, but significant changes in acceptance criteria might force us to re-estimate and reprioritize the story or pull it out of the sprint. It's not easy for users to imagine everything they need about a feature before seeing a prototype of that feature. After the story is developed, I recommend previewing it with the product owner before the sprint review. That should give the team some time to include any last-minute acceptance criteria. If they're small enough, if they're significant, then we would need to write a new story and add it to our product backlog. Let's look at some example acceptance criteria from some of my team's stories. Here are some example acceptance criteria from 6 different user stories. You can see examples of expected field behavior, form behavior, usability, systems integration, and device accessibility. Where an acceptance criteria can't easily be expressed in a few words, like the last one about the opportunity entity, I recommend adding sketches, wireframes, or more elaborate ways to specify the requirement more completely. I don't recommend attaching an entire functional requirement specification, but a small fragment, a page or so, can sometimes help where there are very detailed requirements, and the specification will also help with the testing. Let's put the cards and acceptance criteria together and have a look at some example user stories. In this story, as a salesperson needs to update their sales opportunities so that the sales pipeline is accurate. This is how the story looks in Visual Studio Team Services, which we were using before it was updated to Azure DevOps. In this second example, a smart team member, presumably that's a marketing team, needs sufficient security privileges to be able to deliver email marketing messages. The product owner has added some acceptance criteria to the feature so that it can be tested before it is considered done. In this story, Peter was a persona for a medical physics repair technician at a hospital using Dynamics 365 for asset management. It didn't have any specific acceptance criteria. The product owner was flexible on the definition of what type of notification would be shown to the user if repair jobs were not created for assets under warranty. I could write a whole course just on user stories for Microsoft Business Apps projects. In fact, I'm planning to do just that. In the meantime, let's finish this section with a few hints on creating user stories. You don't have to be the product owner to create a user story. Anyone in the development team can create user stories, and often there is someone with a background in business analysis who creates a lot of user stories on behalf of the product owner. Other project stakeholders can also create user stories. I recommend filtering those new stories during your storytime sessions and quickly triaging them. Although anyone can create product backlog items, only the product owner can prioritize those items. The development team can't commit to a user story unless the product owner has asked them to include it in a sprint. User stories can be created anytime, before, during, or after a sprint. You can have dedicated story writing times, story mapping workshops, for example, but many stories are added and updated at other times. Before you start the sprint planning workshop, your highest priority user stories should meet your definition of ready. For example, the title, description, and acceptance criteria are broadly understood by the development team. I use a discovery phase before launching a new project to create and refine an initial product backlog. It could take a couple of days or several weeks, depending upon the scope of the project. Once the project starts, I recommend scheduling storytime workshops once or twice during the sprint to refine the next set of backlog items and get them ready for an upcoming sprint. A user story is just a reminder. It's not supposed to be a specification. I think it's impossible to write such a perfect user story that it can be done by a development team member with no further discussion. Decades of software development have shown us that the perfect requirements specification is an illusion. The idea that software can be developed without collaboration is a fallacy. User stories are not the answer to a better requirements specification. My teams use a technique called the Three Amigos, which is a short meeting between the developer and the tester who'll get the story done, and the product owner or an analyst who has a deep understanding of the requirement, so that they can get that shared understanding of the requirement and decide how they'll get it done. Epics. Epics are just big user stories. The thing that's special about an epic user story is that it's too big, complex, and risky for a development team member to try and get it done in a single sprint. Here's an example of an epic user story. The lead nurturing epic describes the collection of lead nurturing features that the VP of marketing wants. I like to start with a collection of epics to define the scope of my Microsoft business application. A small project will have 5 to 10 epics that we can address in a few weeks or months. Earlier, we saw the accounts payable user story map. It had 12 epic user stories. My larger projects have involved hundreds of epics and thousands of user stories delivered over several years. My teams use the numbers at the upper end of a modified Fibonacci sequence to estimate epics. Any user story estimated at 13 points or more is considered an epic until we refine it into smaller user stories. I recommend refining epics into implementable sized stories only when they're close to the top of the backlog. The middle and the bottom of your backlog should be filled with epics. They should be vague and imprecise with large, uncertain estimates. Don't refine all the epics in your backlog into user stories. If you're using a backlog management tool, you might use other names for extremely large user stories. Azure DevOps, for example, has stories, features, and epics. Jira has stories, epics, initiatives, and themes. Your terminology may vary. Chores. Next, we'll look at another type of product backlog item called chores. A chore is a product backlog item that the development team needs to get done, but doesn't provide any obvious benefit for your business applications users. Chores are valuable to the development team, but probably not to your applications stakeholders, at least not directly or immediately. For example, you might have a chore to deploy a refreshed training environment. Users will eventually receive training in that environment, but they're not going to be too excited about your work to deploy it. Here's an example chore that's common to every Dynamics 365 project. Perhaps you could refine this item into a story because the testing and training instances should have some value to the users, but I'm usually happy leaving these items as chores. I recommend that your chores are time-boxed, doable, and sometimes estimated. When you write a card for the chore, the team should agree the maximum amount of time they'll spend on it. And as you work on the chore, be mindful of how much time you're spending on it and call it out in the daily scrum if you don't think you can complete the chore within the time box. Doable means that we have a shared understanding of what done looks like for our chore. Our normal definition of done doesn't apply to chores, and chores don't have acceptance criteria, so we need to agree when the chore will be complete. Some Scrum teams do estimate chores because, of course, they consume the development team's capacity. And I know that if we're prioritizing 25 points of chores, then we have to reduce our capacity for stories by 25 points. I used to do that, but I dropped the practice of estimating chores. I don't estimate chores anymore because they're not valuable to our users. And by including chores in our velocity, it can look like we are delivering value to the users. If you want to estimate chores in story points for capacity planning purposes, but want to exclude them from your velocity, then that's probably a pretty good compromise. Spikes. In this next part, we'll learn about spikes. Mountain climbers use pythons or spikes to catch their fall and reduce their risk as they climb a route. And spikes in our product backlog do exactly the same thing for us. Here are a few examples of times when a spike can be useful. To unpack an epic. If you have an epic that you're ready to prioritize and start work on in the next couple of sprints, then you might need to do some work to analyze the epic, chunk it up into smaller stories, analyze those stories, and get ready to start development. If that work is more than you can fit into your usual story time backlog refinement workshops, and you need to schedule some additional time, that could be a spike. To refine a story. If you have a complex story that needs significant refinement because the development team is unclear about the requirements and your product owner would like the team to deliver it soon, then you might need to schedule some additional storytime workshops to refine that complex story. Decide how best to implement it and to estimate it. It could be a spike. To recommend an option. If there are several possible technical solutions to a future story, use a spike to research and evaluate the options and present a recommendation to the team. I recommend documenting the spike as a deliverable. Answer a question. If there is something the team doesn't know, such as whether a technical option is even feasible or not, then a short spike can help you research it and uncover the answer. Can we use Azure Data Factory for the data integration between Adobe Campaign and Dynamics 365? What's the best architectural pattern for timed events in our application? My Scrum team's spikes are often about making decisions. These could be business decisions or technical decisions. I find it helpful to keep a decision log that's reviewed regularly so that everyone's aware of the decisions we've made and we have a record that we can refer back to. We need to remind ourselves why a particular design or option was chosen. Bugs. Just in case you ever find a bug in your application, let's take a look at how to handle defects and bugs. Some teams use different definitions for defects and bugs, but I use them interchangeably. They are undesirable behaviors in our application discovered by our team. I encourage my teams to work collaboratively together to resolve bugs discovered in development immediately. Where possible, there's no need to log it in a bug management system. If it's important, fix it. If it's not, move on. Check with your product owner if you're not sure. But usually our time is better spent working on other items in the sprint backlog than squashing every low severity bug. Your product owner can change the severity and ask the development team to fix it, or she can create a backlog item for it and prioritize it for a future sprint. When something's discovered in production after we thought the item was done, then it's an incident, or some people call them an issue. This time, we log it in an incident management system. And if our development team is responsible for fixing it, then we track it as a bug in our product backlog so that our product owner can prioritize it and we can track our progress resolving it. Bugs should include a short descriptive title, the expected and actual result, what does the user think should happen and what is currently happening, instructions to reproduce the bug, ideally with a screenshot of the result, an indication of the impact, like the number of users affected, and the severity, which is the effect on our business users. Here's an example bug from a recent Dynamics 365 project I worked on. Non-functional requirements. Not every requirement in our backlog should be written as a user story. Let's look at non-functional requirements, for example. A non-functional requirement is an expectation that someone has about our system, or a constraint they want to place on it, about how it operates or behaves that doesn't really relate to a feature of the application. For example, the application needs to be available. Availability is a property of the system rather than a feature, so we can describe our availability expectation as a non-functional requirement. We could try and capture that availability non-functional requirement as a user story if we wanted to. Here's our availability non-functional requirement written as a user story with the user story template. The advantages are that the format of the product backlog item is consistent with most of the other, the way that we've written most of the other requirements. And when written this way, we can tell whose expectation or constraint this non-functional requirement belongs to. Here are some more examples of the types of non-functional user stories you might see in your Microsoft Business Applications backlogs. But you don't have to capture non-functional requirements as user stories. Here are the same non-functional requirements written as simple statements. If you're learning how to work with user stories, then you might find it beneficial to write non-functional requirements as user stories. It's always a good idea to know who the requirement is for and how they benefit from it. Once your team is experienced working with user stories, you might find it more straightforward to write the non-functional requirements as statements like those here. Backlog management tools. Let's wrap up our session with a quick look at some tools you might want to use to help you manage your product backlog. The first thing that I recommend for every Scrum team is a physical Scrum board for managing their sprint backlog. It's just a wonderful physicality about a daily Scrum conducted around a Scrum board and moving the cards from to do over to done. It transmits a lot of information about the team's progress very quickly. Put it somewhere lots of your stakeholders can see it so that it's transparent and we can easily discuss it with them. The same principle applies to our sprint goal, our definition of done, our team members' names and skills, our progress metrics, our sprint retrospective actions, and anything else we've produced. Draw it or print it on posters and stick it to the wall. The principle is called information radiation. It's no surprise that the boards, backlogs, and sprints features of Azure DevOps are probably the most popular software backlog tools for Scrum teams implementing Microsoft Business Applications. The first 5 users are free, then it's $6 per user per month. If you already have a Visual Studio subscription, then Azure DevOps user license is included, which means that most teams usually don't need to buy licenses for their developers. Outside of the Microsoft ecosystem, Atlassian's Jira application is very popular. I've used it for several recent enterprise projects and find it's pretty challenging to use and to configure, but it's been overhauled recently, so perhaps the experience is about to improve for Jira software users. It's free for teams of up to 10 people, which will include most Scrum teams. Then it's $7 per user per month for the standard service level. Pivotal Tracker offers a lightweight backlog management tool with some really nice features that I like. Pivotal Tracker can plan the contents of your sprints and releases automatically based on your recent average velocity, which is a really useful feature for product owners that have only seen introduced into Azure DevOps recently. It's free for up to 3 users and $30 a month for 10 users. That's not per user, that's just all 10. I use Stories on Board for user story mapping. It's got all the user story mapping features nailed in a straightforward user interface. It integrates in both directions with Azure DevOps and with Jira. An editor license is $26 per user per month for the standard edition that includes Azure DevOps and Jira integration. User story map viewers are free. Finally, don't forget to keep a couple of big boxes of Lego around for your Scrum team so that they can express their creativity and build a done increment with a smile on their faces. Thanks very much for joining me in this Tell Me a Story session where we learned how to apply user story mapping, personas, and relative estimation to our business applications. And we learned how we can work with user stories, epics, chores, spikes, bugs, and non-functional requirements in our backlogs, and tools like Azure DevOps, Jira, Pivotal Tracker, and Stories on Board. If you'd like to learn more advanced agile practices for building amazing applications, you're welcome to join the waitlist for my user story mapping course at the Customary Academy. That's customary.academy. The course will be released later this year. While you're there, you you're welcome to sign up for free for my Agile Foundations for Microsoft Business Apps mini course. It's at customary.com/foundations. You can also check out my podcast, Amazing Apps Show, customary.com/listen, and my YouTube channel at youtube.com/customary. I look forward to connecting with you. In the meantime, keep sprinting. Bye for now.